They sent her to the ranch as a cruel joke. Dust clung to her torn dress, laughter fading behind her. The cowboy by the fence didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed. Then, without a word, he lifted his coat and laid it across her shoulders. The wind fell silent. The land around her was raw and endless. Wind scraped against the fences until they whined like ghosts. Every step she took sank into red dirt that carried the weight of 100 forgotten names. A crow called once, sharp and lonely. She told herself she'd come for peace, but peace in Dust Creek sounded a lot like fear. The wagon rumbled away, leaving only the echo of hooves. Men leaned against the railing, smirking. "Won't last a week," someone muttered. She tightened her grip on the small canvas bag she carried. Inside was a letter, folded so many times the paper had gone soft. She didn't read it now. She already knew every word. The cowboy fixed a loose board on the corral gate, movement slow, deliberate. She waited for mockery, but none came. He glanced once, said nothing, and when the chill wind rose again, he simply draped his coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of leather and rain. She stood very still. No one laughed anymore. That night, the fire cracked low in the bunkhouse. Sleep wouldn't come. In the red glow, she saw flashes of another life. The slam of a saloon door, the sting of whiskey on a man's breath, the glitter of a brooch she'd never stolen. Then the sheriff's voice, cold as iron, "Take her away." She ran until the rain turned to mud beneath her feet, and still she could hear them laughing. Morning brought work. Buckets, feed, the scrape of boots on wood. The foreman barked orders, testing her. She kept pace, hands blistered, face streaked with dust. No one offered kindness except the silent man who watched without judgment. Once at the well, he passed her a tin cup of water. Their fingers touched. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and walked away. Days blurred into weeks. The others began to leave her be. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the groan of gates, the hiss of ropes, the steady heartbeat of hooves. At sunset, she would sometimes see him on the ridge, hat low, the sky behind him burning gold. She wondered what kind of man could find peace in so much silence. One afternoon, riders from town arrived, drunk and jeering. They circled the corral like vultures, spitting old gossip. "Didn't they sell you once already?" one shouted. She froze. Before she could speak, the cowboy stepped between them. His voice cut through the dust. "Enough?" It was the first word anyone had heard from him in weeks. The laughter stopped. The men backed away. He turned to her, eyes steady. "You've got more grit than all of them together." The storm came that night, hard and fast. Rain hammered the tin roof, washing months of dust away. In the doorway, he found her shivering. Without a word, he placed the same coat around her shoulders. "Stay as long as you like," he said. She looked up, tears mixing with rain. "I think I will." By dawn, the air smelled clean. The coat hung beside hers on a single peg. Somewhere beyond the corral, the first horses began to stir. In Dust Creek, they still tell the story of the girl who was sent as a joke and the cowboy who taught her that silence can speak louder than any promise. He blizzard howled across the valley, swallowing sound and mercy alike. Through the blur of snow, Caleb saw her, a white figure half buried, wedding veil frozen to her hair. She whispered another man's name before her eyes closed. He didn't know her, but he couldn't walk away. Not tonight. The wind drove needles of ice into his coat as he trudged forward. Her skin was cold, lighter than the snow itself when he lifted her. The wagon beside her was overturned. One was still turning in the gale. A letter fluttered from her hand. Its wax seal cracked, the name already half blurred by snow. He tucked it into his pocket, shifted her weight in his arms, and began the long climb toward the faint light of his cabin. Inside, the fire had nearly died. He set her near the hearth, fed the flames, and stripped off his gloves. Her pulse was weak, barely there under his thumb. He poured water into a tin cup, warmed it with his breath, and touched it to her lips. She stirred, eyes blinking open, still caught between dream and frost. "Elias," she whispered. He shook his head once. "You're safe," he said, voice rough from disuse. She looked around the small room, confusion melting into the slow awareness of survival. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, only the crackle of fire answered. He worked in silence, drying her soaked dress, wrapping her in blankets until color crept back to her cheeks. Hours passed. The wind pounded against the windows. He kept watch, feeding wood into the flames, listening to her shallow breathing. When she finally slept, he found the letter again. The ink had run, but one line was clear enough. To my intended bride, Miss Clara Dawson. He read the sender's name and felt his jaw tighten. Elias Carter, his neighbor. His stomach turned as the wind outside screamed harder, carrying the sound of a man's guilt through the valley. Morning crawled out of the storm like a shy animal, quiet and slow. The fire had burned low, its light the color of honey against the frost on the window. She stirred beneath the blankets, eyes fluttering open to the strange room. For a moment she looked terrified, unsure if she'd survived the night or only dreamed it. Caleb crouched by the hearth, feeding the flames, his breath misting in the chill. When she spoke, his name was a whisper, uncertain. "You're not Elias." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. You were out in the snow. I just brought you in." She tried to sit up, wincing. "He left me." The words broke apart in the air, fragile and cold. He didn't answer, just poured water into a tin cup and set it near her hands. Steam rose between them, thin and silver. She sipped once and looked toward the window where the white light had softened to gray. "I don't even know your name." "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Warren." Her lips moved around it, like she was memorizing the sound. Outside, the wind had calmed, but snow still drifted across the valley. His horse stamped impatiently in the corral. The world beyond the door was pale and merciless. He stepped outside for a moment, breath sharp in the cold. The broken wagon was gone beneath a smooth sheet of white, as if it had never existed. Only a few scraps of cloth marked where he'd found her. He picked up the letter he dropped earlier, the one addressed to Elias Carter. The paper was stiff with frost. He didn't open it. Some things, he decided, could wait. When he went back inside, she was watching the fire, hands clasped as though she was praying, but had forgotten the words. "You should rest," he said. She nodded, but her eyes stayed open long after he turned away. He spent the next hours tending the animals, breaking ice from the trough, checking the fences half buried in snow. Each chore felt heavier than usual, not from work, but from thought. The image of her lying in the drift would not leave his mind. By the time he returned, she was standing, wrapped in one of his old coats, trying to fold the blankets she'd used. "You don't owe me chores," he said. "I can't just sit here doing nothing," she answered softly. Her voice was still hoarse but steady. He watched her for a moment, then nodded toward the table. "There's bread and dried meat. Eat first." They sat opposite each other, the space between them filled with the smell of wood smoke and thawing snow. She ate slowly, careful as if afraid of wasting anything. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you." He nodded. Words were never his strength. The storm outside had weakened to a whisper, the valley blanketed in white silence. She looked toward the window again, eyes distant. He promised he'd meet me at the station, said he had a warm home waiting. Her hand tightened around the cup. When the driver left me, I thought he'd come. Caleb said nothing. There was nothing worth saying. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. He cleaned his tools, set another log on the fire, and finally spoke. "Tomorrow I'll ride to Carter's place." She looked up sharply. "Why?" "To tell him you're alive." He didn't add what else he meant to say, though his jaw worked with the thought of it. She nodded once, then looked back at the flames. "If he doesn't want me," she whispered, "then you'll still be alive," he said simply. When the light began to fade again, the wind shifted, bringing with it a hollow sound from a valley. The storm was moving east, leaving calm in its wake. Caleb checked the door latch, poured water over the coals to quiet them, and looked once more at the woman he had pulled from the snow. She was asleep again, hair loose across his blanket, face peaceful for the first time. He stood there a long while, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing and the distant sigh of the wind. By dawn, he would saddle the horse and ride across the white fields toward Carter's ranch. The storm had broken, but nothing inside him felt calm. Somewhere beyond those hills waited a man who had left someone to die, and before the day was done, Caleb meant to look him in the eye. He blizzard howled across the valley, swallowing sound and mercy alike. Through the blur of snow, Caleb saw her, a white figure half buried, wedding veil frozen to her hair. She whispered another man's name before her eyes closed. He didn't know her, but he couldn't walk away. Not tonight. The wind drove needles of ice into his coat as he trudged forward. Her skin was cold, lighter than the snow itself when he lifted her. The wagon beside her was overturned, one wheel still turning in the gale. A letter fluttered from her hand. Its wax seal cracked, the name already half blurred by snow. He tucked it into his pocket, shifted her weight in his arms, and began the long climb toward the faint light of his cabin. Inside, the fire had nearly died. He set her near the hearth, fed the flames, and stripped off his gloves. Her pulse was weak, barely there under his thumb. He poured water into a tin cup, warmed it with his breath, and touched it to her lips. She stirred, eyes blinking open, still caught between dream and frost. "Elias?" she whispered. He shook his head once. "You're safe," he said, voice rough from disuse. She looked around the small room, confusion melting into the slow awareness of survival. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, only the crackle of fire answered. He worked in silence, dry her soaked dress, wrapping her in blankets until color crept back to her cheeks. Hours passed. The wind pounded against the windows. He kept watch, feeding wood into the flames, listening to her shallow breathing.